Hi, I'm Kelly Cline. I'm the featured quilter at the Kaw Valley Quilters Guild Show at Crown Toyota in Lawrence, Kansas this weekend. So I'm going to take you on my journey and take you around to my quilts and share a few stories about every quilt. When I started quilting, I was not a quilter. I was a sewer and I was a garment maker. So I'd never made quilts before. But I was given 20 years ago, I was given my grandma's quilt to finish. She had done a quilt in a class and she had quilted it, pieced it, and then hand quilted it. And she was going into a nursing home and my dad said, could you find something for her room? And I found this beautiful quilt that she had started on in a black trash bag in her house. I took it home, I hand quilted, hand pieced it, and I took it back to her in her room. She was about 93 years old. And I held it up and I said, Grandma, look what I did. And she said, oh baby, that's beautiful. And I said, well, you made it. And she said, oh honey, I'd never make anything like that. And I said, Grandma, you made it and I finished it for you. And she had 2 twin beds in her room. And she said, well baby, could you make me one for the other bed? And I said, no, you made the quilt. So I finished the quilt, I now have it. She passed when she was 95. So I'm tickled to have this quilt in my possession now. When I first got my long arm machine, which was quite by accident, I was working at a bookstore and I'd been there for 15 years, and as the bookstore was closing, they had decided to close the store. The last woman that came in to sell her books, the store was half-price books, so we bought used books. And the last woman that came in, one of the last people, was selling her quilt books. And her name was Georgia, and I said, Georgia, why are you selling all your books? And she said, well, Merle, her husband who'd come along with her, she said, Merle's been really sick and I don't have time to quilt anymore, so I'm selling everything. Well, she had a long arm machine, and I, being not a quilter, I had no idea what that was, and Merle hollered at me one day. He said, come see that machine. And so I went out to their house, I got on their machine, I got on these handles, and I just went crazy, and lightning struck and I shivered. I'd been a calligrapher all my life, so the muscle memory from the calligraphy translated completely to the long arm machine. So I ended up buying a brand new one. I did not buy George's, but they introduced me to something that would be my passion for a long, long time. So when I first got on the machine and I had it, I realized, hey, I'm not a piecer, I'm not a quilter, I don't have tops to finish. So I started on eBay and antique stores. I started buying a lot of tops. And this was the first quilt I did on the machine. It was $10 on eBay. So it wasn't fancy, but it was beautiful. It's 1930s fabrics, 9-patch, simple 9-patch. And I put it on the long arm and I just quilted all over. I didn't care what my quilting looked like because it was a busy quilt, so nobody was going to see the quilting. So what I love from the back, it shows what my quilting was like when I first started, which brings me to my favorite quote comparison is the thief of joy. So don't compare your work to my work, compare your first work to your last work. And so this is my first work that I always compare to. I love this quilt, it's one of my favorites. So early on I realized that I needed to finish all the quilt tops of the world. So this is where I started. This is one of my first custom quilts that I did on the long arm. So I'd probably been quilting maybe 3 or 4 months, but remember, I didn't need a whole lot of practice because I'd been a calligrapher all my life. So the motion of handwriting, that's called muscle memory. So muscle memory, along with long arm quilting, it all works. So when you're quilting, think about your handwriting because that's how it works. So this was my first custom quilt. I designed it pretty heavily. I really wanted to learn my spirals. So, if you want to learn spirals, do 4 yards of spirals because it will get in that muscle memory and you will know it by the end of the quilt. So when this was done, this one's called Flowers for Juniper. And my little 8-year-old now granddaughter was a baby, and when I would long arm, when I would babysit her, I would put her in a front pack. And for the first few months she was facing me and I could long arm while I had her in the pack. Earplugs too, don't forget your earplugs. I had them in her ears. So then when she was about 3 or 4 months old, I turned her around, and one day when she was 6 months old and I was working on this quilt, she grabbed the handle and just pulled it. And I thought, oh my gosh, she's messed up my quilt. And I was new, I didn't really understand that. And what I've learned from this quilt is that it's not a mistake, it's always an opportunity to do something that maybe you wouldn't have done. So I realized, because there's so many swirls and so much going on in this quilt, I wrote in here, Junie was here November 25th, 2013. So I always invite people to see if they can find that sentence in the quilt, because I'm pretty sure you can't. Only I know where it is. So don't worry too much about your quilting. Doesn't have to be perfect. It makes it kind of fun. So now it's a little bit of a historical quilt. So I early on started going to antique stores and finding these fabulous quilt tops, but then I started finding these hand-stitched tablecloths and embroideries. And at that time, about 2013, I would quilt anything. So it didn't matter what it was. If it was fabric, I would quilt it. If it wasn't attached to your body, I would quilt it. So I found this antique tablecloth in the antique store down in Lawrence, Kansas. And it was a full tablecloth, but what I loved about it, there was a half of it that was not stitched yet. So there was a needle that was stuck in the bottom and the pattern had not been finished yet. So I think I bought it for $13. I don't know why I remember these things, but I know it wasn't much. I cut the bottom off and I played with it on my long arm. I'm only 7, maybe 8 months into my long arm quilting at this point. So I have a machine, I have a Candy Quilter Forte with a computer. So I use this piece to test and figure out all my computer motifs at that time. I also did some free motion hand-guided quilting. But I love this because it was the first quilt in my quilt show, which is here. I'm 9 years later, and this is really a full circle moment for me, because this quilt was seen by Barbara Brackman, who's in my guild, and Barbara came over to me after she'd seen this quilt and she said, Kelly, are you quilting for people? And I was not, but I said, sure I am. And so she said, well, I have a book coming out. Do you think you could finish something by June? And it was April. And I said, sure I can squeeze you in. So she was my first for hire customer. And I told her later on that she was my first one. But she gave me the courage to quilt for others. So that's when I started quilting for other people. Okay, these, I've decided that these are like my firstborn. These are pillow covers from the early 1900s, and I have people ask me, oh, Kelly, did you embroider those on your Bernina embroidery machine? No, these are original pillow covers. So they're from probably early 1900 to about 1930. And they were made as a kit, just like we have cross stitch or crewel. So they came tinted. So they were tinted and they came with floss and directions and needles, and the women would decide what part they wanted to stitch and what they wanted to leave tinted. So this is my collection. I started finding them very early in my quilting life. And the first one I found was this beautiful Kansas pillow cover in an antique shop in Russell, Kansas. And I saw the embroidery and I was so fascinated by it. And of course, because I was quilting everything at the time, I had to get it quilted. So I found that one, and then I started finding more and more. The cool thing about these is that a lot of them are silk embroidery. So you've got silk as the original embroidery. Like I said, they were made as pillows, and pillows came into fashion on your couch about 1907. So you would find a lot of these kits. They're pretty much one of a kind. I've not ever found duplicates, and I have amassed a pretty good collection of about 300 pillow tops. Don't tell my husband, but I love them. They are my passion, and I try and squeeze one in every now and then. About a year into my quilting, I really wanted to start working more for people and quilt for hire, and I thought, if I create a Facebook page, I wouldn't tread on my long armors, and I thought maybe I would find people across the country that would send me their tops. So I did that, and people started sending me their tops, and I started quilting for them, and before I knew it, I was about a year booked. So at that time, Handy Quilter found me, and Handy Quilter is my machine brand. They're out of Salt Lake City, Utah, and they asked if I would be an ambassador for them. So I became an ambassador for Handy Quilter, and they wanted to do a webinar on quilting vintage linens. So I needed to create kind of a backdrop for my class. So I created this hanky quilt, which is a vintage 50s tablecloth with random hankies, various hankies all over. They've, in a sense, been appliqued to the background. So each one has its own treatment, and I, of course, put my Kansas hanky right in the middle. People always ask me, what is my favorite quilt? Do I have a favorite quilt? And I've decided it's like your kids. You can't pick a favorite kid. So on a given day, maybe you have a favorite child, but on this given day, this is probably my favorite quilt. This one's called What Was She Thinking? And I have a story for every quilt because I feel like with these vintage tops, I've got a spirit with me. So I've got this woman, it could be a man too, I've got a woman that's over my shoulder and she's so excited that I'm finishing her top. But this one's so crazy and so out of square and so out of shape and so colorful that I had to tell a story while I quilted this one. So the way I see this is that the woman sent her husband to the feed store to get feed sacks. And she said, honey, make sure you get 5 matching feed sacks. So he got to the store and the guy at the feed shop said, you gotta have what? And he said, well, I need 5 matching bags. And so the guy started finding the bags. Well, the 5th bag, maybe the 4th bag too, was on the bottom. And the guy said, really? Does she really need matching bags? And the farmer said, nah, probably not. So they just picked random feed sacks because this is all feed sack. And she was so upset when he got home. And so she just decided, well, we're still gonna make that quilt. So she got her mom and sister together and said, here's some for you, here's some fabric for you. And they created these squares, but nobody knew what size they were all supposed to be. So these are random squares, random shape, random size, and I love it. It's one of the craziest quilts I own. This one's called Bodacious Bow Ties. I found this at an antique mall in Columbia, Missouri, Artichoke Annie's, which I love. And it was just a small piece, almost like a bed runner. It was not a full-size quilt top. And I fell in love with it because the bow ties are just this size. They're teeny tiny, so they're about a 1-inch finish. And I was so impressed by the woman that, whoever made this in the beginning. And when I got it on the frame and I started quilting it, I realized why she only made it this big, because when she was done making it this side, she's like, there is no way I'm making a full quilt out of this. So this one is stunning, it's tiny, and it's really perfectly pieced. This one's called Stirring the Coffee Again. So I've been very fortunate to quilt for a lot of what I call celebrity quilters, and Mary Kerr is a good friend of mine, and I met her pretty much when I first started. And Mary would give tops to long armors and have them finish in any way that they wanted to. So this was one that she gave me for her book Twisted, which I adore that book. There's so many good ideas in that book. So she gave me this top, and it was white with these raw edge Dresden plates on it. And I had it for about 4 months, and I was really struggling with the negative space. And so when I'm struggling with a quilt, I lay the top across my couch, I study it, and then I go to bed. And I usually dream about what the design should be the next day. So I woke up in the morning and I had this nightmare that I couldn't get my cream stirred into my coffee. So I knew that was a sign, and so I started spirals on these Dresden plates because I saw those swirls in my coffee. So once I did the swirls and I just did some straight line quilting, I shadowed the circle on the side, and it turned out to be such a twisted quilt, old turned vintage turned modern. So I love that concept. When I was so infatuated with shopping antique stores early on, well, I still am, don't get me wrong. I was really into tablecloths for a while, so I've morphed my life through many different phases of quilting. This was my tablecloth time, and I had found 2 different tablecloths. This one's cut work, and this one's drawn thread. So I'll talk about the cut work first. This one's called Ode to Talene, and this design, it's all thread painted. It's put on Dupioni silk, and so that the cutouts, you always need an underlayment when you have cutouts, because of course you need something to be the base of it. So my good friend Talene Jeffrey lives in South Africa, and she had created some designs, and when I saw her designs come out, I had to have one. So I bought her design, and then I placed it on this cloth, and this is all thread painted design. And then I added this little tatted edge, and it's all beaded. So I love this one. It's just fancy. And then this was a drawn thread tablecloth that I did really early on. I put gold lame under the whole thing, so that's my underlayment that comes through. A society silk doily in the middle. And the cool thing that's happening right now, which I had no idea this could happen. I've got a group that owns some hotels in the world, and they are creating they need a carpet created. And one of their clients saw this quilt on my website, and they've asked if they could use my quilt in their carpet design. So with that comes a little bit of royalty, and I'm pretty excited about doing that for them. This quilt, this crazy quilt, is called Bubble Bubble Toil and Trouble. I found this one at Faithful Remnants in Wichita, Kansas, and I fell in love with the color, with the design, with the whole wonky nature of it. What I've determined is it's a 2-generation quilt. So the story I tell myself, because I always have to have a story to every quilt, is the grandmother had these few pieces, because if you can see, there's a color difference. One's really dark, one's light. The lighter ones are feed sack, and then the darker ones seem to be like a 60s or 70s dress linen. So I think that I'm guessing that the granddaughter found this in her grandmother's things, and and she thought, I can finish that, I can do that. Well, she wasn't a quilter, and she had no idea how to put these together. So that's what makes it a little bit crazy. I keep the shape the way that it was made because I respect the maker's work. Because if I chopped off part of the work, then it's going to chop off her pattern. So I always leave all my quilts, I always leave it the way it was. So all my quilts are not square. I don't worry too much about square, because really, does a square quilt make you any warmer than one that's not? I don't think so. So I respect the maker's work. I love how this turned out. It really is one of my favorites. This quilt is called Helping Hands, and it's called a palimpsest quilt. P-A-L-I-M-P-S-E-S-T, palimpsest. So this is a quilt. Palimpsest means starting with something original and then changing it, but you can still see what was original. This pattern was called Boston Common. It is called Boston Common, and I found it in the bottom of a box I bought at an auction in Russell, Kansas. So this quilt was in the bottom, but I bought the box for the tops, thinking I can't wait to finish those tops, and then this came out. And it had a few holes, but I was so impressed by the quilting. So the hand quilting on it, it was all hand pieced, hand quilted, and I just couldn't let that go. So I decided to change it a little bit, patch the holes, not patch them traditionally or conventionally. So I took lots of doilies and embroideries and anything I could find and started patching holes, and then I started making a pleasing collage. So this is a work in progress. I will work on this forever because it's beaded, it's quilted, it has lots and lots of things on it. It will be an art quilt when it's finished. It is not a usable quilt. Periwinkle Made Modern. That's the name of this quilt. The pattern is called Periwinkle. And I got this at a garage sale this spring for $30, and it was at Barbara Brackman's garage sale. I saw it listed in our guild newsletter, and I told my husband when I saw that we are going to be there early. And so we got there a little bit before it started, and I saw people already up there, and I was a little scared because I knew Barb would have some really good stuff. So I walked up, and a woman was holding a whole handful of tops. And oh my gosh, I was a little like, that's what I really, really wanted. And so I walked up. I'm not bashful. I used to be a really bashful little girl. So I walked up kind of by her in my social distance because we're in COVID times. I walked up and said, oh, those are beautiful. And she said, yeah, I've seen lately where they're taking quilt tops and making clothing like jackets. And I said, yeah, they're doing that, but those are really pristine, and those are from the 1930s, and they're really beautiful. And she said, well, what would you do with them? And I said, well, I'm a long arm quilter, so I will just finish it as it was meant to be finished, as a quilt. And she said, oh, well, then you should have them. So I'm tickled that I was the one to get them. I took it right home. I would think I was at the garage sale at 8, and at 9 o'clock I had it on the long arm. So this is a mix of computer and hand-generated, hand-guided quilting. So each little solid area has flowers, and then I've quilted by hand around it. This is a good example of where you should spend your money in custom quilting, because when you have a solid area, that's going to show it off. If you have a really busy quilt, you're never going to see your quilting. So this is pretty beautiful. Again, not something I would ever square, because if I squared it, I would cut off her pattern. I found this signature quilt at Faithful Remnants in Wichita, Kansas, and I fell in love with it because it's 1930s original fabrics. It was in pristine condition. It was very white. I didn't even need to clean it. and it had lots of dates on it. So it had dates, these are all birth dates from when these people were born. So 1866, 1900. I believe they did this quilt in 1935 as a fundraiser for the town. So I've quilted it, it's got some computer generated flowers, and what makes it really great is we have a history. A friend of mine, Vicki Hull, created the genealogical history. She went in and took all the names and made a nice report, so we have a history and a story to go with the quilt of everyone who's signed this quilt. This is a quilt that was beautifully, beautifully created by my cousin Bonnie Fisher in Russell, Kansas. She did this to honor her mother, Mildred Eichmann, who was my aunt, and this is all of her mother's handwork. And you think this might be a lot, but she has more. So she's created more quilts out of this handwork. So she took each piece of her mother's embroidery, she added a little bit of history in it, some dates, and then I quilted it for her. And it is seriously one of the most beautiful quilts I think I've ever worked on. And the history of it and the sentiment of it is just beautiful. All right, this quilt was found in an antique shop in Augusta, Kansas last year, and it had holes in it. It was not in great shape, but I needed to save it, and it was $20, so I couldn't pass up a $20 top. It's an improved 9-patch, and she's got some pretty tiny little pieces here, mostly feed sack, curved piecing. I put an edge to edge on it because when I have a busy quilt, I just like a edge to edge to cover the whole thing, get it quilted, and get her done. My biggest challenge on this quilt for me was this scalloped edge. It was not as hard as I thought it would be. I was really excited that I had original feed sacks that I could make the binding out of, so it really blended with all the feed sacks on the quilt. Finally, I call this my masterpiece. This is the culmination of all my work, all my hours. You know, I like to say you can't learn you can't learn anything if you just spend an hour or two on it. I know a lot of people get frustrated with their quilting. They think after they've done it for a day or two and they're not any good at it that they're never going to be good at it. But it's like anything we do. You got to put in the 10,000 hours to be good at anything, sports, piano, music. So this is my over 10,000 hour quilt. This is called Champagne and Caviar. And this was a tablecloth that I bought on eBay. It was $50. I did not spend enough on it. The woman said to me after I bought it, she said she didn't think it brought enough, and that was because she didn't take good pictures. So there's a lesson. Take good pictures when you sell things. So I got this. I was just overwhelmed by its beauty. It has been, so the original embroidery is silk, and it has been double stitched. So it's got cotton over silk, or cotton underneath, and then silk thread on the top. It's been all hand guided. It took about 300 hours to finish, and there's about 1,000 hot fix crystals and beads covering the quilt. So this one's just spectacular. I love it. I will probably never do that again because it was really an involved process. There are lots of things I've quilted over the years that are small, that are just fun projects. These are the things I've taught in workshops, tried to get people to get the things out of their drawers and made into something modern. So don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to cut things. Don't be afraid to use your mom's or your grandma's pieces, because that's how you're going to honor them and that's how they're going to live on. So a few things I'll just go through that I've made: pillows, tote bags, framed pieces. So let's look at just a few. There's a nice doily pillow. Doily's just randomly placed around. I've quilted it. It's got an envelope backing. Another pillow. This is a biscuit doily because, you know, back in the day they needed to make everything beautiful. Put on satin. And again, just an envelope pillow. Tote bags. Love to make tote bags. This was a dresser scarf that came from a friend of mine in Australia, Lynn Finley, in Adelaide. And she gave me this dresser scarf, and I cut it in half and then made a tote bag. And of course we've got koala fabric as the backing. Another tote bag, satin. It's a little red tote bag, satin with cut work on top with some fancy trim. This started out as just a shopping bag. Dressed it up a little bit. Another pillow cover, an appliqued piece of fabric, doilies laid around and then quilted. reproduction fabrics. Hankies. Oh my gosh, I went through a hanky phase. And then one of my favorite all-time embroideries is called Society Silk. Here's a beautiful piece of Society Silk. It was popular in the late 1800s. You can Google that and read lots more about it. Okay, and finally, this last year, we've been in COVID for the last year and a half. We're kind of coming out of it, but my passion and my focus right now is making pin cushions. So pin cushions have been my joy. They've been my therapy, and so I have a bunch for sale every week or two, but I brought some to the show yesterday, but I have 3 left today, so I'll let you look at those. I own 1 or 2 of my own pin cushions, and we'll just end with my favorite pin cushion that's mine. I hope you all enjoyed the exhibit, and happy quilting, everybody.